Welcome to the ECNP Congress Preview podcast series, where speakers from the upcoming ECNP Congress in Amsterdam share their perspectives on the current state of their field, highlight key challenges and emerging opportunities, and offer a preview of what to expect from their symposium session at the Congress.
Hello everyone, my name is Friederike Holze. I'm a researcher at the University Hospital of Basel at the Division of Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology, and I have been involved with psychedelic research for many years now. In addition, I'm also part of ECNP's Early Career Academy, which is an initiative that was started in 2024 in order to give early career scientists a platform to get involved with ECNP. At this year's ECNP conference, which will take place in October in Amsterdam, I will be chairing the Psychedelic Research Symposium titled Psychedelics and Plasticity from Synapses to Cognition, currently being scheduled for Tuesday morning. The symposium will be an interdisciplinary symposium containing preclinical and human research around psychedelics. And today I'm speaking with Linda Simmler and Fred Barrett. Hi, Linda, and hi, Fred.
Hello, hi everyone.
Hi, Frida and Linda. It's nice to see you both.
Linda Simmler is an assistant professor and head of the Neuropharmacology Research Group at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And Fred Barrett is director of the Center of Psychedelic Research at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the US. Both will be speaking in the symposium in Amsterdam, and both are conducting very interesting research in psychedelics, which we will talk about a bit today to give you a glimpse into what is awaiting you at this year's ECNP conference. Even though psychedelics have been part now of the ECNP conference for many years, I'd still like to give you some background. So what exactly are psychedelics? Psychedelics are a class of psychoactive compounds that profoundly alter perception, mood, and cognition. Some of the most well-known examples include LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. At the core of their action is the serotonin 2A receptor, and when psychedelics activate this receptor, they trigger widespread changes in neural activity, and these changes potentially promote something that's often referred to as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections. And that's exactly why these compounds are generating so much interest right now. Recent clinical studies suggest that psychedelics don't just alter consciousness temporarily, they may also offer rapid and lasting relief for conditions like depression, anxiety, and addiction, sometimes after just one single dosing session. So it's truly a fascinating field, one that seems to hold immense potential for the future and that would also need a lot of research. So Linda, can you tell us a bit about your research career, your background, and what brought you to where you are right now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a preclinical researcher, and I would say everything started already with my PhD thesis project on the pharmacology of psychoactive drugs, specifically MDMA and amphetamine type designer drugs. So I found it very fascinating to learn what drugs do in and to the brain in a good and in a bad way. And therefore I continued to do research on psychoactive drugs, cocaine and ketamine, for example. Also during my time as a postdoc at the Vanderbilt University in Nashville, in the US, and as a scientific collaborator at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. So initially my research focus was on the neuropharmacology of potentially addictive drugs of abuse like amphetamine and cocaine. But I always had also quite a focus on the serotonin system in my research, which brought me actually via glutamatergic neuroplasticity to the therapeutic effects of psychoactive drugs like ketamine and psilocybin. And since almost 2 years now, I have my own lab at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and we focus on the understanding of the neurobiology of psilocybin.
Interesting. And how about you, Fred?
Yeah, thanks. So I got into this research, I like to say a bit by accident. My first degree program was in music education. but upon exposure to psychology and neuroscience, I really found a greater passion. And I worked for a few years as research assistant at the University of Pennsylvania, helping to run studies of affective and cognitive dysfunction in patients with schizophrenia. But during this time, really learned that my love of music was driven by an interest in understanding more about the mind and the brain and the really wildly varying experiences that we can have as humans. And I brought that full circle in graduate school by studying the effects of music on the brain and using music as a tool to study emotions and memories and how they're reflected in the brain. And um, during that time, I learned about and then was able to help participate in conducting psychedelic research at Hopkins, with psychedelics yet being another tool to really deeply interrogate different experiences and how they may not only help us to understand ourselves and our place in the world, but also how they may help us to better understand, a range of psychiatric illnesses and how we may be able to treat them. And so now, that's really been driving my interest at this time is really, how can we use these varying tools that we have to really better understand the mind and the brain, and sometimes how things are broken, and if they're broken, maybe new and inventive ways of how to heal.
Very fascinating. And as mentioned previously, this is an interdisciplinary symposium. And with that, Linda, can you tell us a bit about what your main area of research is?
Yeah, so my research is on preclinical neuropharmacology with a circuits neuroscience approach. So trying to understand neuroscience in the context of neural circuits. So, and also I have to say the ongoing research of my lab is now exclusively focusing on psychedelics, with main focus on psilocybin. And methodologically, we have a very strong focus on synaptic plasticity with or without optogenetic identification of the neural circuits. And we also do a lot of behavioral models in mice to investigate the mechanisms of psychedelics.
Truly fascinating. So, Fred, where do you see yourself at home?
In not too dissimilar from Linda. One of I would characterize my main areas of research as twofold. One is trying to understand basic human neuroscience and the effects of psychedelics on brain networks. So, in a similar vein as Linda, understanding brain circuits that are involved in perception, cognition, affect, decision making, and then how these are altered during the acute effects of psychedelics, but then also how they may contribute to the pathophysiology of depression, substance use disorder, other psychiatric disorders, and fundamentally, not only understanding what psychedelics do during the acute subjective drug effects, but also how they may lead to long-term changes in these circuits, and how those changes in circuits may really support healing in people, even with very treatment-resistant or intractable illnesses. And that kind of leads over into my other kind of main area of interest, which is understanding the effects of psychedelics in patients with mood disorders, primarily, including depression, but then also patients with depression in the world often have other co-occurring disorders, including alcohol use disorder, other substance use disorders, anxiety, and basically, I'm focused on understanding how psychedelics may be used to treat patients with those illnesses.
In addition to that, Fred, what do you think are the most important questions in your research right now?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few, and I can boil them down to the most important ones. Include what fundamentally changes in the mind and brain of a person who's suffering from an illness after they take a psychedelic. Why would people go, for instance, from smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or more to completely writing off nicotine and tobacco? How can people who have suffered for years or decades from negative ruminations. How do they gain the capacity for psychological and cognitive flexibility, or to rethink the way they think about themselves in order to to recover from that depression? So really understanding what fundamentally changes is very important, but not independent of that is, well, how can we predict who is going to respond well to a psychedelic therapy? And of course, not everyone shows a therapeutic response to psychedelic therapy. And some people, independent of whether they show a therapeutic response, can have an incredibly challenging experience, either psychologically, physiologically, or otherwise. And I think predicting those things will help us to better focus treatment on patients who will be most likely to respond, and then possibly optimize therapies for those who may not respond initially, or maybe find other interventions for people for whom psychedelics will not respond. And finally, I think an enormous question that we're all struggling with is looking ahead to see how psychedelics will really look in the real world in health systems after if and when they're approved as medicines. And so, we have two very different models of how psychedelics work in terms of how to deliver psychedelic therapy. And those main models are, well, what do psychedelics look like in clinical trials? And then also, what do psychedelics look like in otherwise kind of unsanctioned settings, or lesser differently controlled settings, like retreat settings or even underground therapy settings? And these are two very different use cases, which I would argue don't really directly inform what psychedelics will look like as an approved medicine in a healthcare system. And I think there's still an awful lot to learn about how to adapt both clinical care models and clinical trials models.
I agree. These are indeed very important questions to ask. Within preclinical research, the most important questions will be a bit different, I suppose. So, Linda, can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with everything Fred said. Super important. And preclinically speaking, it's the first question that you put out there, like, how is it possible? That's really where my interests lie, where the preclinical research goes towards to. And specifically here, the keyword would be neuroplasticity. So which specific neuroplasticity underlie the therapeutic effects of psychedelics? That's really something that our research should answer. And by specific neuroplasticity, I mean to understand which neural circuits are crucially involved, and what does it mean then on a functional synaptic level? How do synapses change to get to that neuroplasticity, which underlies a therapeutic effect?
And I assume, Linda, that you are facing some challenges there. What are the biggest challenges currently in your research area?
Yeah, so I would say a big challenge is that we are still lacking a direct causal link between observed neuroplasticity induced by psychedelics and the therapeutic effects. So psychedelics, they do so much to the brain. The acute effects are really profound in terms of changing consciousness, and they affect many, many brain areas. And then there are long-term effects as well. So it is plausible that there's many neural effects, possibly even some long-term changes that are not required for the therapeutic effect. I mean, that this is to answer from the research side. So thanks to beautiful research from the field, we are beginning to understand the mechanisms leading to neuroplasticity. We're beginning to understand the mechanisms leading to therapeutic effects. And at this point, we should establish this causal link through smart experimental strategies that we can actually do preclinically. And because here preclinically lies the strength that we can use tools, bioengineering tools like in vivo optogenetics in mice. And like this, we can eventually prove that certain neuroplasticity would underlie a therapeutic effect, if it's the case. So if we get this answer preclinically, I think we could provide a very crucial addition to the debate to what extent neuroplasticity can stand alone. That means without the hallucinogenic experience for the treatment of depression or mental disorders.
Yes, I agree. These are very, very big questions and challenges to ask. So now that Linda has elaborated a bit on the preclinical challenges, what are the biggest one in the clinical research, Fred? What do you think?
I think that one of the greatest challenges in clinical research right now is a double-edged sword of hype and fear. There are people who are real true believers in the power of psychedelics, who emphasize the success of psychedelics while kind of minimizing the risks that do exist. And folks, at least in the States, who are going as far as arguing for, decriminalization and legalization of psychedelics in ways that I think, are potentially going to lead to harm. As we know, psychedelics have an incredibly favorable physiological profile compared to many other drugs, yet they have, pretty clear and substantial risks in uncontrolled or unskilled settings. And so, you know, hype and over exaggeration of the benefits and minimization of the harms by some is, I feel, a real challenge because it's a risk to the field. But in the same vein, I think undue harm comes directly from fear mongering and continuing drug war tropes and treating psychedelics as something far more dangerous than they actually are. And I think that both of these forces work in tension to kind of make it a little more difficult to communicate objective scientific and evidence-based information about psychedelics, which we will need to do very clearly for lawmakers, policymakers, clinicians, and the general public. If psychedelics are ever to be approved as medicine, so that people can truly have an objective understanding of the risk and benefit. So I think that's a challenge that we're working with right now as a field, is how best to communicate these things without bias in an objective fashion while not succumbing to either hype or fear. Another challenge for the field in a different dimension altogether is funding. With so much incredible uncertainty, at least in the States, regarding federal funding for research, and with tensions regarding private funders around the world of much of the research that has been conducted so far. We really need a robust and stable and unbiased, objective funding stream to continue this good research, so that we can come to the answers we need to determine, how, if and how psychedelics can be used as medicines, and also then wrapped around that, better understanding, what are the optimal parameters under which psychedelics should be administered. Do we need two therapists in the room at all times? Do they need a certain level of licensure or training? What are the best therapeutic approaches, standards of care that can be paired with psychedelics to optimize therapy, or should they? Truly coming together with a modern, evidence-based, forward thinking therapeutic model. I think this all falls under the umbrella of implementation research, and far too little implementation research has been done yet.
So summarized, psychedelics are a large and fascinating field that, besides holding a lot of potential, also holds a large amount of interesting questions and challenges. So I suppose we will not run out of work within the next few years. And as already mentioned, the two of you will be speaking in Amsterdam this year. Linda, maybe in one sentence, can you give us a little heads up on what you will be speaking about in Amsterdam?
Yeah, I'll be presenting our recent finding on synaptic plasticity induced by single dose of psilocybin in mice. And I also have something very interesting to show about pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics also in mice.
Oh, we will be looking very much forward to that. And Fred, maybe also very short, what will you be speaking about?
Thanks. I'm hoping to give what will be a final update on an ongoing trial in patients with depression and co-occurring alcohol use disorder, where 85 out of 90 people total enrolled as of today. And, there are two phases, a blinded first phase and then an open label second phase. And so far, data from that open label phase are remarkable in response rates for both drinking and depression. We still don't know if this is truly due to psilocybin versus placebo, but we'll be able to answer questions about 1 versus 2 doses, whether one is more durable than the other. But I hope to be presenting hot off the presses primary outcome data from that trial, as well as a battery of neurocognitive and neuroimaging tests that we've conducted with these patients to determine if there's anything at all that we can use to predict outcomes, and if we can get some purchase on what may be underlying these outcomes. And I have a strong hypothesis about the role of a brain structure called the claustrum and claustrocortical circuits that may be underlying and mediating some of these effects. So stay tuned.
So we'll really be getting some new and exciting research to hear this year. And so we are already arriving at the final question. And this should be very short and can just be like something exploratory. What do you think will we be thinking about our current research in 20 years from now? And maybe this time, Fred, you can start.
Well, I hope that in 20 years, we will be thinking about how brave we were to dig into these things. But I also predict we may have found other compounds than the ones we're working with today that do a far better job. And I hope that we'll look upon this and say, oh, what interesting and foundational work, how far we've come in helping to understand these things.
And Linda, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question that you're asking. I don't know, but I'm sure it will include something like that we say, how little did we know back then? Incredible. And also, on the other hand, we would say, well, these were really important experiments that we did back then. I'm quite certain about that too.
That's good to hear that you think that. And with that, we're coming to the end of this conference preview podcast. Thank you, Linda and Fred, again, for taking the time to speak with me today. I hope this has sparked your interest in attending this year's ECNP conference and the Psychedelics Symposium. I'm looking forward to seeing many of you there.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from ECNP. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the interviewee and do not necessarily reflect the official position of ECNP. The content of this podcast should not be used in any way as the basis for treatment decisions.